Is this a potential trap game for the Philadelphia Eagles? Can the Carolina Panthers potentially pull off one of the biggest upsets of the season? Find out here on Crossover Thursday. Locked on Eagles, Locked on Panthers.
You are Locked On NFL Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome on in, our everydayers, to another edition of the Locked On Eagles and Locked On Panthers Crossover Thursday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team each and every day, making us your first listen or watch of the day. I'm your host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Gino Camilleri, joined by host of Locked On Panthers, Julian Council. And on today's episode, Eagles, Panthers, two teams in completely different polls when it comes to the NFL. But can Carolina pull off an upset, and can the Eagles continue to dominate? But before we talk about that, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Crossover Thursdays presented by Prize Picks. Download the app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. All right, Julian, it was a emotional matchup last week for the Carolina Panthers in overtime. I'm sure Eagles fans that haven't been watching the Panthers are saying, how can this team really challenge the Eagles? Well, they were in a close battle last week against Tampa. How did they keep it close? Let us know.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not just the game against Tampa last week. The week prior, they faced off against Kansas City, and they went down there and tied the game with a minute 46 left. And, well, they left too much time on the clock for Pat Mahomes, and he did Pat Mahomes' thing. So it's not just been last week. It's been the last 2 weeks, really, where this team's coming out of the bye and playing its best football of the season. And prior to that, had the win in Munich against the Giants in overtime, had the win against the Saints at home. So the last 4 weeks, this team has been playing well. And why? Well, because Bryce Young has been playing the best football we have seen him play so far as a Panther, putting together back-to-back solid performances where in the first 18 starts of his career in Carolina, there's a lot of questions about whether he would be the quarterback. As we know, he's benched after 2 games this season, and Dave Canales, head coach here, was talking about Andy Dalton was going to be the starting quarterback. Even when he was asked, would you ever go back to Bryce Young, he kept talking about Andy. But Bryce has come back. He's played well, and that's the reason why the Panthers have been competitive the last 4 weeks and have been able to go toe-to-toe with teams like Tampa, who I think is going to be a playoff team, and, of course, Kansas City, who is probably one of the favorites for the Super Bowl this year.
I know teams in this position, they can either check out really early into the season. And I think if you watch some of those teams playing on Thanksgiving that happen to play in the NFC East, you might see that. Is Carolina one of those teams? And I think the last 4 weeks might tell us otherwise. But is Bryce Young really rejuvenating that locker room and getting this team ready to go week in and week out to the point where he's auditioning for QB1 for next year?
Yeah, I mean, the Panthers, I suppose, could have been put on quit watch at some point this season, especially after Bryce was benched and when they get shellacked on the road against Washington with Andy Dalton as their quarterback. He throws a pick 6 on an opening drive. That's not been the case. And Dave Canales has brought that up multiple times this season, how these guys have continued to play hard even when they weren't getting stops on defense early in the season. They're still struggling to do that even right now, but I think they've improved overall the last couple of weeks defensively as far as tackling goes, but offensively, they couldn't move the ball. But you have never seen this team give up. Even in that Bears game where they're getting blown out, they still were able to get some things late in that game. Same thing against Denver on the road when they got some garbage time points there. And Bryce Young actually looked decent in his return in that garbage time in the fourth quarter. He absolutely is auditioning for the next 5 weeks to be the starting quarterback in 2025. And looking at reporting I saw last week from Dan Graziano and from Jeremy Fowler of ESPN, they were opening up the door for Bryce potentially to be back in Carolina. Then on Sunday morning, Ian Rappaport's talking about that as well, that if Bryce keeps showing the Panthers things that led them to take him number 1 overall, which he's been doing the last couple of weeks, he would be in line to start in 2025. And honestly, that's the best case scenario for the team. This is not like it's the best quarterback draft out there. And you look at the teams right now in the draft ahead of them, like the Giants and like the Raiders, they're in line to take Cam Ward out of Miami or Shedeur Sanders out of Colorado. Carolina was not going to be in place to do that, especially with the wins they've gotten recently from Bryce Young. So the best thing they should be focused on is him continue to develop, continue to grow with these young receivers like Jalen Coker, the UDFA out of Coastal Carolina, Xavier Legette, who they drafted in the first round, JT Sanders, they got in the fourth round out of Texas. Keep growing with those guys, Jonathan Brooks as well, and try to build on that heading to next season, and then continue to build the team around Bryce and hope that he continues to play like this beyond and shows that he is truly your franchise guy.
A lot of people in Philadelphia, I think, can really feel what you just said, that looking at this class, it's not a grass is always greener type of things. Young Jalen Hurts, there are a lot of people saying, hey, there's guys out there that could probably do X, Y, and Z, but then you let them develop, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe the guy we do have is the guy that we want to go out there and battle week in and week out. I will say Jalen Hurts is playing some of the best football we have seen in this stretch, and he's doing it against quarterbacks that he should be beating. The story for the Eagles is, how do they continue this stretch run? And I introed this saying, is this a trap game for the Philadelphia Eagles? Looking at the remaining part of the schedule, they play Carolina, then they play Pittsburgh. Huge battle there for the state of Pennsylvania. Then they have Washington in their final road game of the season before they finish out the year with 2 divisional tests against Dallas and the Giants. Regardless of where Dallas and the Giants stand, it's an NFC East matchup. They're going to want to ruin the season for the Eagles. If there was one game on the schedule for the Eagles to maybe overlook and say we have some bigger aspirations, it's this Sunday. That's the one thing I'm worried about. And how the Eagles avoid it? It's Jalen Hurts not turning the football over, not playing down to your level of competition, running the ball well. Because if Carolina, let's just say Jadeveon Clowney, who we hate Jadeveon Clowney in Philadelphia for some past things he did in his days in Seattle, if he all of a sudden has a strip sack on Jalen Hurts, let's say, and it's close going into halftime, Carolina's going to be a team that's gritty. Like you said, Julian, Kansas City, they were in that game all the way until the end. A overtime game against a potentially playoff team in Tampa last week. Who's to say that they can't do that again?
Yeah, and I look at the schedule too, and you brought up you have coming up, and you're going to have 2 games against Dallas and against New York that should be automatic wins. And I would think with a 12.5-point spread, which FanDuel has right now in this game on Sunday, this would also be viewed as a game that the Eagles should win. But after that, you got a couple other games that are going to be pretty difficult. I look at Detroit, man, because they're sitting there top of the NFC right now with that home field throughout, and whoever gets it between either, I would think the Lions or the Eagles, is probably the team most likely going to play in the Super Bowl. They got the Packers on Thursday night. They got the Bills still left over. They got the Vikings. They have a couple of games right there that they could lose. So for Philly, absolutely, you can't drop this game. But Carolina, as I mentioned, is a team that is completely different the last 4 weeks than they've been in the first couple of weeks of the season because of the way Bryce Young has played. Now, defensively, they have struggled against the run. I know Philadelphia is second in the NFL in rushing yards as a team. Saquon Barkley leads the league in rushing so far. That's going to be a tall task. But if Bryce Young continues to play the way he's played the last couple of weeks, taking care of the football, being decisive, being accurate, and the guys on the outside help him out by catching the ball, which has been somewhat of an issue the last couple of weeks, even though Dave Canales said he's not that concerned about it, still wants to instill confidence in some of those guys, they can be in this game. It's going to have to be a shootout rather for them to be able to do that, because I do not think they're going to be able to hold down Philadelphia defensively. But it could be an interesting game depending on how Bryce is able to play and he can continue that trend he's had over the last month of the season.
And we'll get into some of the points and some of the things Carolina needs to do to win this game, some of the things the Eagles need to do to win this game. But Julian, you boiled it down perfectly. That has been our sentiment all week long at Locked On Eagles. It's almost like you're an everydayer of our show. They can't slip up for a team that has big time aspirations to potentially host multiple playoff games at home. When the schedule makers gifted you this game, you have to approach it the same way you did when you got the schedule back in March. That this is a game we were potentially gifted. Now we have to go and close it out so we can keep pace with Detroit, who has some tough tests ahead. But I think there are some pesky players on the Panthers. Lou and I talked about this yesterday on our show, and we'll talk about it when we come back here on this Crossover Thursday edition. Locked On Eagles, Locked On Panthers. This Crossover Thursday is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with America's #1 One sportsbook over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you're watching this Sunday's matchup between the Eagles and the Panthers, and you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. It's only one Abraham Lincoln for a chance to get 15 times your money. 30 times your money. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This episode is also brought to you by our friends over at Hillsdale College. Time is our most precious commodity, so don't waste it scrolling through the same mind-numbing content for hours and hours. We all know the sites. We have the apps on our phone. We all do it. So how can you spend it wisely to improve yourself? Our friends over at Hillsdale College are now offering more than 40 free, that's right, 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, the meaning and history of the Constitution, Introduction to Free Market Economics, The Great American Story, A Land of Hope, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and brand new documentary-style courses on Marxism, socialism, and communism. All of Hillsdale's courses are self-paced so that you could start whenever and tune in wherever. Plus, you can go deeper with readings, quizzes, discussions, or just enjoy the lectures. Go right now to hillsdale.edu/lockdown to enroll. There's no cost. It's easy to get started. That's hillsdale.edu/lockdown to register. hillsdale.edu/lockdown. All right, everydayers, welcome on back. This crossover Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles and Locked On Panthers is brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. All right, Julian, we set it up with the biggest stories. Now let me hear, if the Panthers are going to win this game, give me 3 points. What do they got to do to perfection to beat the Philadelphia Eagles on Sunday?
Well, they got to stop the run, and that has been something they have not done all season long. Even in games against the Giants in Munich and on the road against Denver, where they didn't give a ton of yards per play against the run, they still gave up 130-plus yards, and that's just not a winning formula, especially against an Eagles team where they're likely expecting to go over 200 yards rushing in this game on Sunday. And based off of what Carolina's been giving up this season, like last Sunday against Tampa Bay, where they gave up 236 yards, that would be the expectation, should be the expectation for Philadelphia heading into this game. So if Carolina is going to have any sort of chance to win this game, 150 feels like the sweet spot. They're not going to hold Philly to 50 yards. They're going to hold them to 100, 150, keep it relatively calm, I suppose, considering just how bad they've been against the run this season, and that will give them an opportunity to win this game on Sunday. Secondly, I mean, Bryce Young's got to keep doing what he's been doing. I mean, talked about this last week. You got to continue to see the growth, the momentum that he's been able to build the last couple of weeks, really his confidence, taking care of the football, all of that the Panthers have seen out of him, and that's leading a lot of those reporters out in the NFL, which are probably in their sourcing from that organization to believe that Bryce may be back next year in 2025. And looking at the market just college football-wise and free agent-wise, he may be their best option. Of course, there's the Russell Wilson factor, as he has experience here with some of the guys who are here in Carolina, like Dave Canales, who are in Seattle, a large portion of his offensive coaching staff. So you can never rule that out. The only way you can rule it out is if Bryce Young plays well the next 5 weeks, especially gets an upset on Sunday. And then he's got to get some help from his friends. The receivers have had their moments of, I wouldn't say brilliance, but of really showing that they could be pretty solid moving forward. Young guys like Jalen Coker, who should be back this week after missing the last 2 weeks. Guys like Xavier Legette as well. We still have not seen that game-breaking speed from him just yet. Adam Thielen, he has been someone who has been reliable. Chuba Hubbard as well, just not really as a pass catcher out of the backfield, but as a rusher, had that key fumble last week. Bryce has done everything the last 2 weeks to help this team win games offensively. He just has not gotten enough help from his friends. If he gets some help from his friends on Sunday and they're able to stop the run and he keeps doing what he's doing, then quite possibly Carolina can shock I don't know if the world, but can certainly shock a lot of people out there by beating a team where they are a 12.5-point underdog to on the road to Philly on Sunday.
And I'm going to stem right off of that for my first point, how the Eagles continue to dominate. And it's to not allow Carolina to score 20 or more points in this game. Those last 4 games you talked about for Carolina, Julian, for our fans, they beat the Saints by scoring 23. They beat the Giants by scoring 20. They only lost by 3 to the Chiefs, who scored 30. The Panthers scored 27. And last week in overtime, they scored 23. The Eagles have won a lot of their games in this 8-game win streak by keeping teams to under 20 points. Even the Ravens last week, for a majority of that game, even into garbage time when they scored, they were able to keep them below 20. You made a great point that if the Panthers are going to win this game, you said this in the first segment, that it's going to be a shootout. I would have to agree. This thing would just get out of control. It would turn into a tire fire, and all of a sudden maybe 60 or 70 points are scored between these two teams. You have to keep the Panthers under 20 points. Now, how do you do that? I'm going to steal one of your points. Run the football. I say this every single week on these things, but keep it simple, stupid. I'm sure one of your elementary teachers taught you that back in the day, and you have to keep it simple, stupid in this game. Hand the ball off to Saquon, allow him to continue to do what he has been doing, and don't allow Jalen Hurts to take unnecessary shots downfield, which is going to put the ball in a precarious position. And the Eagles have allowed Jalen Hurts to make plays, but they've also scaled back the amount of throws that he has had to make in this stretch. He's not putting the ball 30, 35, 40 times in the air. It's anywhere from 15 to 18 to 21 attempts a game. The guy who is getting a large majority of the target share and the rush share and everything when it comes to scrimmage yards, it's Saquon Barkley. Number 3, continue to be dogs on defense. This team has dominated in the trenches on the defensive line and made opposing quarterbacks get off of their platform, operate off schedule. If you look at what Lamar Jackson did really well last week against the Eagles, it wasn't in structure. It was when things broke down, he turns into Superman, and then he does something crazy that he does to every team in the NFL. Bryce Young, if he stays on time, in rhythm, that's where he is going to hurt you. If you can keep him contained in the pocket, don't allow him to escape with his legs, get home on those sacks where you're getting 5 or more, that'll lead to turnovers. That'll lead to forced fumbles. In the last 2 weeks, this defense has forced more than 5 fumbles and recovered 0 of them. That has to change at some point. If it's going to change, hopefully it is this game. But I want to ask you something, Julian. If there's one X factor for the Panthers that the Eagles, not one of the big names, just somebody that's under the radar, who do they have to watch out for? Let us in on that little secret.
Who would be the X factor in this game? I mean, that's a great question. I would want to say like one of the receivers, like Xavier Legette, potentially having one of those breakout kind of games. Like there's not really anyone I look at who's going to completely change it. You would hope maybe someone like an edge rusher, but they're not going to likely face too many passes considering how poor they played in the run game. So maybe like someone like Josie Jewell. Jewell played a great game against New York over in Munich, where he had an interception in that game. Also was able to punch the ball out. That, or I guess that was Ashawn. It was either him and Ashawn Robinson who punched the ball out that led to that turnover right there in the first play of overtime, where Carolina then was able to kick that field goal. But he has been pretty good for them since he came back from both a groin and hamstring injury a couple of weeks ago. And knowing that Philly's going to run the ball a lot in this game, and he's their most experienced linebacker as he's playing next to the rookie Trevin Wallace, he's someone who could really step up, maybe be able to get the ball out on the ground if Carolina gets some takeaways, which they did last week in a game where I felt like they outplayed Tampa until defensively they gave up a lot there in that fourth quarter and in that final drive in overtime. He would be the one I'd look at X factor wise defensively, who maybe could change the tide of this game on Sunday.
Another great point. And Josie Jewell, he's not going to have to defend Dallas Goedert, who is out at the tight end position. So in coverage, that's probably something that favors Carolina a little bit more. But in terms of favoring Carolina, Vegas is not in favor of the Panthers at all. The Eagles are 12.5-point favorites. We're going to get into, can the Panthers at least cover in this game, hopefully. Not overlooking them from an Eagles perspective. They still got to get the job done. But Vegas thinks it might not be as close as some of us here do at the Locked On Podcast Network. But stick with us as we finish up this crossover Thursday edition, Locked On Eagles and Locked On Panthers. Locked On Eagles and Locked On Panthers crossover Thursdays brought to you by Mint Mobile. With big wireless providers, what you see is never what you get. Somewhere between the store and your first month's bill, the price you thought you were paying magically skyrockets. With Mint Mobile, you'll never have to worry about gotchas ever again. When Mint Mobile says $15 a month and you purchase a 3-month plan, they mean it. Any of the big boys, and you know their names, I'm sure, just like me, you've seen your bill, what you thought you were paying at the store. No. They somehow trick you. Well, Mint Mobile is here to rescue you and offer high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network while allowing you to keep your phone with all your numbers and contacts and ditch all of the overpriced wireless providers simply by going to mintmobile.com today. To get this new customer offer and your 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/LockedOnNFL. That's mintmobile.com/LockedOnNFL. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/LockedOn. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. All right, Julian, finishing up this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles and Locked On Panthers podcast, brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks. Right now, FanDuel has the line as the Eagles being favorites at 12.5 points. Do you think the Panthers can keep it within the line at 12.5?
I think they can, and it's been interesting as I saw this line on Sunday. I looked at it again on Monday, on Tuesday, and, of course, here today as we are recording this show the day before it actually comes out on that crossover Thursday. And, yeah, man, this has not budged at all. And I can understand. Philadelphia's won 8 straight games. They are the hottest team in the NFL and quite possibly the best team in the NFC. Please, Eagle fans, don't come after me. I think Detroit's better than you right now. Now, of course, they could lose tonight. And then right there, Philadelphia can step in the conversation, maybe win this game on Sunday and be right there. I don't know what the tiebreaker would be, whether they'd have it over Detroit or not, but still they'd be right there on par as far as trying to battle for that number 1 seed and get that. Because you want to have multiple playoff games at home, Gino, but you only want to play 2 games at home in the playoffs. You don't want to play 3, you want to play 2, and that's possible for them. I mean, obviously you want to play 2 if you're going to be the number 2 seed, but either way, you know what I'm saying. I go back to kind of what you said earlier about the Eagles holding teams like around 20 points. The Panthers have only gone over 30 points once this season, and that was week 3 on the road against Las Vegas when Andy Dalton was their quarterback. Bryce, of course, led them to 27 points the week prior against Kansas City. Last week, they got up to 23. He's been playing well, as I mentioned multiple times so far on this show, and I think it's going to take them getting to that 30-point number to be able to win this game on Sunday. And then another thing you brought up too was just, can you get pressure on the quarterback? Carolina was terrible last year protecting their quarterbacks, whether it was Bryce for the majority of the season and that one game in Seattle when Andy Dalton played. 65 sacks they gave up last year. They've only given up 21 so far this season. That has been one of the biggest areas of improvement for Carolina so far this year. So I don't think that Bryce is going to be under siege on Sunday. And if he is, that would be certainly disappointing, especially knowing that Brandon Graham's done for the season, that Bryce Huff is not out there right now. Like, there's not guys on this roster that you should be thinking about they're going to go crazy against Carolina offensively up front on Sunday. So I think they can cover. It's going to come down to also maybe running down that clock a little bit more. It's going to likely be a game. There's not a lot of possession, so maybe that lowers the score anyways, and be able to stay out on the field, convert on 3rd downs, and really convert into red zone. They're 3 for 10 the last 2 weeks into red zone, which has been a major issue for a team that going into last week was 10th in the NFL in red zone scoring percentage as far as touchdowns go. So surprising that they've been this poor the last 2 weeks against 2 teams in Tampa and Kansas City, who I think would be playoff teams. 2 teams, certainly they should have beat Tampa. They could have beaten Kansas City. Like, that's where they can keep it close. If they can convert in the red zone, score touchdowns, not kick field goals, where they missed 2 last week with Eddie Pinheiro, who had been on a long streak of making field goals, especially at home. So I could see this being a 28-17 game and Carolina be able to cover that spread. I could see them maybe losing this game like not even, I wouldn't say 24-14, but I think they can get there at least about 10, 11 points and not get blown out by 2 touchdowns or something like that. I think they can absolutely cover on Sunday against an Eagles team that certainly is the better team.
It's funny that you brought up that 17-point number. FanDuel currently has the total for Carolina's points at 16.5. So if you're looking at the over total of 45.5, you're realistically saying that the Philadelphia Eagles are probably going to have to score anywhere from 25 to 28 points in this game, which I would expect them to do. I said this to Lou on yesterday's show on Locked On Eagles, and we've said this for months now. They have the best bit in the NFL. They are statistically the 32nd ranked team on the first 2 drives of football games. And after that, offensively, they are the number 1 team. It is the greatest bit. No comedy writer could come up with that if they wanted to. But I think this thing is close before halftime. I think the Panthers covering that first half line would be something to consider. But the Eagles in the second half of football games, and Saquon Barkley statistically by himself has dominated in the second half. If you take his second half rushing on the season, that would put him 4th among all teams by himself when it comes to yardage total on the ground. So
I need you to tell me that stat again, though. They are the worst team in the NFL in scoring on the first 2 drives.
Yes, they do. They haven't scored a touchdown on an opening drive all season long. I believe they've only scored once or twice when it comes to field goals on the first drive of the game. But statistically, in terms of EPA and multiple metrics, they're 32nd on those first 2 drives. In the first quarters of games, they're not great. But then to close it out, they are first according to all those metrics. It is
doing that because that's going to catch up to them pretty quickly once you get to January, because there's no way. I mean, if they play Minnesota, I mean, Darnold could certainly give you a couple. They're not beating a Brian Flores defense if they aren't going to score in the first quarter. Same thing against Green Bay, against Detroit. Like that sounds like what ends up being the death of the Eagles if that does not change over the next couple of weeks. Like that's a terrible trend to start off the half.
This hopefully is the game to at least maybe get the monkey off their back and be like, all right, guys, like we can actually score the first drive of games. It would be nice, but call a spade at this point in the season. They're 10-2. It's been 12 games. It's not going to change right now.
Yeah, it's who they are.
Have to figure it out. It is who they are.
Yeah.
And who they are is a team that hasn't turned the ball over much. They have to continue to do that. The one thing that has really killed them, penalties and sacks. Those have destroyed drives for the Eagles. If the Panthers are able to create pressure, Jalen Hurts will hold on to the ball for quite a long time. He likes to be Superman, and you have to take the good Superman with the bad of that. He is going to make some good plays off structure, but at the same time, there are some sacks that come from him trying to create something that is never going to be there. At the same time, he's only turned the ball over twice since the bye week, something that really affected him prior to the bye. Both of those turnovers came against the Cowboys a couple weeks ago. He's protected it well. They've ran the football well. They played really good defense. But this is a game I don't think they can afford to look over. And I'm sure our fans of both of these teams are going to be tuned in this Sunday as the Philadelphia Eagles play host to the Carolina Panthers. But until then, that'll do it for myself, host of the Locked On Eagles podcast, Gino Camilleri, and host of the Locked On Panthers podcast, Julian Council. Until then, make sure you make Locked On NFL your second listen each and every day with the madman Tyler Rowland and the barber Tony Wiggins. Make sure you subscribe to all of the shows across the Locked On Podcast Network. We thank you for making us your first listen and watch of the day. And until next time, you know how I always end it. Fly, Eagles, fly.